Jack Kennedy had a very, very serious medical problem.
He was not going to admit that he was sick. There's nothing he was going to say he could not do.
Kennedy was more promiscuous with drugs and pharmaceuticals than he ever was with women.
It was the height of the Cold War, as America and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of all-out war. President John F. Kennedy had his finger poised over the nuclear button, but all was not well in the White House. Kennedy was a man grappling with physical and mental demons.
The events were slipping out of control. Where would it have ended? In utter disaster.
While the fate of the world hung in the balance, the president of the greatest power on earth was battling debilitating disease and drug abuse. The story behind the story of the Kennedy years. An unsolved history.
And I can assure all of you here, we will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
When he was nominated for president in this building in the summer of 1960, John F. Kennedy was the very image of youthful energy and vigor. But there was a side to John Kennedy that was kept hidden all his life. Over the next hour, Unsolved History examines the disturbing medical history of this iconic leader.
Senator Kennedy, a tireless campaigner, goes to all sections of the country, spelling out his views on domestic...
In July 1960, when Senator John F. Kennedy began his campaign to become president, Americans faced a turning point in their history. Do they vote for the gray establishment figures of the Eisenhower years? Or do they vote for a young, dynamic, and progressive Kennedy?
Kennedy was trying to suggest that he would be something very, very different, that he would be a strong leader, a dynamic leader. Let's get the country moving again after 8 years of rest with Eisenhower.
I made my judgment long ago that the basic issue of this campaign was the question of whether the people of the United States believed it was time they started moving again. They started going forward again.
Kennedy, in his campaign speeches and as president, used to talk about vigor, and people used to always joke about his urging the American people to be vigorous and to exercise. And he really did contribute to a physical fitness craze that swept the United States and much of the world, I guess, and still is with us.
It was the beginning of a new era. People sensed that the American dream was within their reach.
There was a new generation. The people that had really led the Allies in the war were fading out. Churchill was going, Ike was gone, the old generals had all retired, and there was now the GIs, the people that fought the war, the young men. And there was this great upsurge in America, people going to college on the GI Bill, you know, cooking steaks, building cars, doing a lot of things that had been put off literally for the better part of 20 years if you throw in the Great Depression.
Journalist Hugh Sidey was assigned to cover Kennedy's campaign for Time magazine and was impressed with what he saw as a new breed of politician.
It was apparent to me that the Kennedys were way ahead. They understood the system, they understood new politics, they understood so much that none of these other people really understood. By the time of the convention, I was quite convinced that he'd get the nomination and he would win.
But Kennedy was hiding a secret he feared would expose his public image as a sham and torpedo his chances of becoming president. In July 1960, John F. Kennedy was poised to win the nomination of the Democratic Party, his first step to becoming president. But an incident from his past was about to come back to haunt him. 13 years earlier, in 1947, a doctor is called to a London hotel. One of the guests is seriously ill. He's confused and dizzy. He's too weak to stand. His body is racked in pain and he can't stop vomiting. He drifts in and out of consciousness. The guest is John F. Kennedy.
He was a friend of Pamela Churchill, she called her father-in-law, Winston Churchill's doctor, who came over, examined him, got him up and whatnot, and then said to her out in the hallway that your young friend hasn't long to live.
The doctor had recognized all the hallmarks of a rare and life-threatening condition: Addison's disease. Kennedy's adrenal glands, vital organs essential to the body's defenses, had failed.
The adrenal glands make cortisol, and it's a terribly important hormone. It's one of the most important hormones. And what cortisol appears to do is act as a stress hormone. And if you don't have cortisol, you don't respond to stress. So the patient just feels tired, they feel debilitated, they look rather emaciated. Life just isn't worth living.
Kennedy was only 30 years old, but the Addison's disease was robbing his energy and vitality. But the events in London showed that the disease also had a sinister and unpredictable side.
The danger is that they may suddenly undergo some sort of severe stress or some sort of accident. The body then hasn't got the reserve of cortisol to fight that, and it can be lethal. They can die.
Kennedy's trip to Europe was cut short, and he returned to the care of his American doctors. For Kennedy, the outlook was grim. He had been diagnosed with a disease that was sapping his energy and could strike without warning during times of great stress. But instead of opting for a quiet life, he kept his illness hidden and was now actively seeking the highest office in the land.
Kennedy had this image of this dynamic, young, healthy man, in contrast to the grandfatherly Eisenhower. That was what the whole campaign was about. And of course, the great irony is that that was not true, that this was a sick man.
The Kennedy campaign would soon face disaster when the true state of his health was revealed. To reach the White House, Kennedy first had to secure the nomination of his party as their presidential candidate. But his rivals were out to stop him. India Edwards, the Southern Democratic Party leader, had somehow unearthed Kennedy's secret.
My recollection is that India Edwards said that Kennedy had a very, very serious medical problem, which is Addison's disease, and she urged the press to go learn about Addison's basically being a killer disease.
Kennedy was on the ropes. If the public knew the full extent of his condition, he'd never be elected. So Kennedy decided it best to issue a blunt denial.
John F. Kennedy does not now, nor has he ever had, an ailment described classically as Addison's disease. Any statement to the contrary is malicious and false.
He said it was untrue. She was a liar. She couldn't respond effectively enough. Lyndon Johnson apologized, and people forgot about it.
Kennedy strongly tried to deny that he had Addison's disease, and his denial stuck. Kennedy said, "I have never had Addison's disease. I do not have Addison's disease."
Kennedy knew absolutely he had Addison's disease. He was taking the medicine every day for years. I mean, his great struggle was to achieve the presidency before he died. I mean, he expected not to live that long.
Kennedy's denials were believed, and he won the nomination of his party. But now he had to win the election. On this occasion, his Addison's disease would prove an asset rather than a liability.
Side effects of Addison's are that you have a perpetual tan. It gives you not jaundice, but something along the way, and your hair never turns. So that John Kennedy always looked like he was coming off the beach, and he had this great head of brown hair and whatnot, which in fact were side effects of the disease.
One of the most interesting things about his Addisonian bronzing is that it might have been, ironically, it might have been responsible for his winning the election over Richard Nixon. Because in 1960, there were 4 television debates, the first time we ever had television debates between the 2 major party candidates. And that first debate with Nixon probably affected the outcome of that election dramatically and probably changed the course of American history.
As the campaign gets underway, the presidential candidates meet face-to-face in television debates seen and heard by millions of people. the same people who will decide which of these two men shall lead the country.
And the thing that seems to have affected perception so dramatically, first of all, was that Nixon was sick. He had a fever, he was perspiring, he was just, it was not his night. Whereas Kennedy looked to be not only cool, but tanned and healthy. And Kennedy won that first debate hands down.
Jack Kennedy, he was made for television. He was, because of his illnesses, he was skinny, and he showed a warmth and a lovely smile, and people liked him.
As morning comes to the cities of the eastern states, the newspapers headline Senator Kennedy's election to the presidency. Yet at this hour, the popular vote is so close that it appears he will win by a plurality of less than 1%. So John F. Kennedy, the 43-year-old senator from Massachusetts, becomes president-elect of the United States.
Looking tanned and healthy, Kennedy scraped through with the tiniest of margins.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Although Kennedy had fulfilled his dreams of becoming president, he had misinformed the American people by denying his Addison's disease. But Kennedy had spent his whole life refusing to be held back by ill health. As a child, he had spent months confined to his bed, plagued by fevers and mystery illnesses. This constant fight against illness would play a crucial role in forging the young Kennedy's character.
I think he had a difficult childhood. Not only was he ill frequently, but the children were encouraged to be very competitive, to play tennis, to play baseball, to play touch football, and to be captain of the team. His father used to say, you have to be captain of the team. You're a Kennedy, you have to be number one. You know, you can't be number two. But for John Kennedy, this was a real problem because he was ill. He was not like most of his brothers and sisters. They were much more healthy than he was.
Jack Kennedy's younger brother, Bobby, wrote in his memoirs,
"When we were growing up together, we used to laugh about the great risk a mosquito took in biting Jack Kennedy. With some of his blood, the mosquito was sure to die."
That Kennedy family was very competitive. Old man Joe was always pushing them. I just think that Jack had a mental desire to prove to his daddy that he was a winner.
You just can't, you're not to be a sissy, it's to be a chicken. You're not to admit these things. You just go out into the world and do what you have to do. And when he's 16 years old, he's taken out to the Mayo Clinic to find out what's wrong with it. And during this summer, he writes letters to his friend Lem Billings. And in these letters, he talks about the wild sex life he's having at the Mayo Clinic, how he's sleeping with the nurses. He's just having all these great times. I think that those letters shouldn't be taken literally, that this is this young man who does not want to be sick, and at this point, Kennedy kind of projects this other character out into the world, this healthy person. He invents this healthy Jack Kennedy as a teenager, and that's the Kennedy that goes out into the world.
The denial of his illness in pursuit of this fictitious heroic figure would drive Kennedy throughout his life.
He had developed a sense of himself, a glorified sense of himself, that he was this powerful figure, that he was this dynamic figure, which ironically he turned out to be. He told a reporter on one occasion, "I have always seen myself as President of the United States." He was the weakest of the Kennedys, and ironically he ended up as the strongest of the Kennedys.
Ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
It wasn't just determination that carried Kennedy to the top. For most of his adult life, Kennedy depended on a daily intake of powerful drugs. As he was sworn into office on that bitterly cold January day, evidence of his medication was clear to the expert eye.
President Eisenhower, the former president's doctor, was watching him on television. He was, of all the people out there on the podium, Kennedy was the only one who did not have a coat on. And he was perspiring. And the doctor said, ah, that's because he's taking an extra injection. Well, he wasn't taking injections, he was taking pills at that time, but I'm sure he took an extra pill that day.
By the time he was elected president, John Kennedy was taking daily doses of a new wonder drug called hydrocortisone to keep his Addison's disease under control and boost his energy. The pills were a synthetic version of the stress hormone his body lacked. But when Kennedy was first diagnosed, these drugs were not available. He was dependent on a far less effective treatment, and his illness was still apparent.
Met John Kennedy in 1957. I went up to the Senate. I was doing a story for the Old Life magazine. I got on an elevator with a rather sickly, skinny, unimpressive-looking human being. I was introduced as Life's new reporter to John Kennedy, Senator John Kennedy. We shook hands. We were both unimpressed with the other one, but it was the beginning of a long friendship.
By the end of the decade, hydrocortisone was readily available, and Kennedy was able to lead a far more active life.
Each of the two candidates travels more than 60,000 miles.
I was out there with him, 20 hours a day some days, through snow and cold, and he was up at 5 o'clock at the factory gates, and then he'd have 2 or 3 speeches in the morning, and then we'd fly someplace else, and he'd have a rally, and then we'd go till midnight. Now, don't tell me an invalid could do that, and that's the part of Kennedy I saw. Did he take pills? Yeah, he took pills. Did he take a nap? Yes.
But journalists were not told that Kennedy's tireless 1960 campaign was fueled by an endless supply of cortisone stored in safety deposit boxes around the country, and it was up to Kennedy to decide how much to take.
If someone is taking cortisone or a drug of that type, and they clearly will feel miles better compared to how they felt before, then it's quite reasonable to say, well, I'm feeling a bit better now. Maybe if I take some more, I'll feel even better. And particularly if you then become slightly manic, that means sort of overactive and over-enthused with life, it would be quite easy to say, well, I'll just take a little bit more and I feel even better that way, and really slightly lose contact with how well you're doing or not. And unless the amount of drug is limited by their own doctor, who can watch them and monitor them carefully, it's quite easy to overdose.
But with Kennedy, there was no one doctor in overall control.
3 doctors were probably calling the shots at the same time, without any of the other doctors knowing that one or another was involved. You've got a prescription for a disaster there, because too much and you drop over into the mental and emotional side effects of the drug. Increased anxiety, restlessness, hallucinations, panic attacks, insomnia, increased sexual libido, loss of judgment, and multiple effects.
As Kennedy had an unlimited supply of cortisone, it's impossible to know what exact quantity he was taking. Evidence suggests that he was overdosing.
The photographers right around the presidential campaign noticed a lot of the physical appearances, what we call the moon face. The face sort of swells. There's inappropriate adipose tissue deposited, or fatty tissue deposited in the subcutaneous layers.
Excess use of steroids could have had a profound effect on Kennedy's behavior. Behavior that would compromise his own security.
Over-medication with steroids frequently induces a sense of, a heightened sense of risk-taking, awareness, just sort of ignoring the risks that are there, does induce hypersexual activity in certain individuals. Kennedy was a formidable risk-taker.
JFK liked to live on the edge. And to me, he was much like a person running through a fire with a full gasoline can. His manner gave us cause to be concerned with him exposing himself to people that we couldn't vet, putting himself at risk, and actually the office of the president at risk.
Fellow Secret Service agent Tony Sherman was also charged with protecting the president, no matter what it took.
If somebody suddenly burst in that door, my whole goal, my whole purpose in life is to get in front of that person. Now, whether he has a gun in his hand and is shooting, or whether a knife, or he's just going to come and punch, the president, my job is to get there. If we can take the bullet, that was our duty. From time to time, it was a little bit deflating to us in that we would, without hesitation, take a bullet. And at the same time, he opened himself to security risks, which were absolutely nonsense. And we would look at these two things and wonder, I suppose, and each in our own way, as to why this was necessary.
But Kennedy's sexual adventures were to add one more ailment to an already long list.
He had venereal disease, chronic venereal disease. In doing the book, I came across the records in the Leahy Clinic, and they had treated him for VD constantly from his teenage years. So it had that effect.
Jack Kennedy's sexual adventures have become legendary, but the latest medical evidence suggests that this behavior may have been exaggerated by the powerful drugs he was taking. This behavior was to become a national security issue when he started seeing Ellen Romish, thought by some to be an East German secret agent.
She had been brought into the White House for Kennedy by one of his friends, and of course Kennedy just had no clue, and he never looked to see who he was meeting. It adds new meaning to sleeping with the enemy.
And the president called me and said that was the best party he'd ever been to.
And there was the Republican senators going to make an issue out of Ellen Romish and her association with the person in the White House. And Kennedy gave that assignment to Robert Kennedy to handle.
Romish was spirited out of the country, and Kennedy avoided a scandal. But despite this close call, it seemed that Kennedy could not control the urges brought on by his medication.
Sex to him appeared almost to be compulsive, and I think that was part of his life, much as to all of us, maybe like brushing our teeth or taking a shower.
Even though the cortisone had some troublesome side effects, Kennedy could not have survived without it. But it was a condition that the cortisone could not treat that still prevented him from leading a normal life. He was plagued by another serious condition, chronic back pain.
He was born with a malformed spine. He had one leg shorter than the other, which is a common cause of back pain. I knew his brother pretty well, Bob Kennedy. Bob said he thought that his brother never had a moment without pain.
You could see his pain. You could see sometimes how he'd stand very stiffly, and his hands at his side with his fingers kind of extended, like he was almost trying to shift the pain from his back down to his hands.
He slept a lot, more than people suspected. He worked 2 or 3 hours a day, often in the morning, in bed, again, so there was no weight on his back. And he spent a hell of a lot of time in the bathtub and worked in the bathtub. He would be, it certainly gave an indication his staff would be sitting in dark suits around toilets and whatnot, or squatting on the tile. And then he spent a lot of time in the White House pool, which was heated to 87 degrees, so that it was like a bathtub. When Kennedy visited Macmillan at Chequers, they were stunned. The Macmillans were stunned to find out that all sorts of ambulances and medical equipment and special rocking chairs and pads and heating devices and whatnot all came before Kennedy did, because he used all those things to keep himself going.
In spite of all this medical paraphernalia, the pain kept returning. Kennedy had been saved from the ravages of Addison's by modern pharmaceuticals, so once more, he turned to drugs.
Kennedy would take any medicine, any time, under any circumstances, if it would give him any kind of relief.
His back pain was initially treated using localized injections of Novocaine, a powerful painkiller. But the Novocaine wasn't enough, and Kennedy turned to a maverick doctor whose prescriptions would change his life.
Andy Warhol and his people were all using a doctor named Max Jacobson, who was up by the Plaza Hotel.
He had treated people in New York and such people as Truman Capote and Eddie Fisher, and they were cured miraculously within 10 minutes of receiving an injection. And so he just achieved the nom de plume of Dr. Feelgood.
Max apparently was a great guy. People liked having him around, and he was kind of the combination court jester and court physician.
From time to time, the president seemed pretty frisky afterwards, and kind of perky, and felt good.
He would not bring in a medical bag, but he would bring in a briefcase. And on one occasion, I checked it, and it was full of vials, and they clinked when he walked. We just knew then it gave you a kick.
It wasn't until 1971 that the public discovered what was in Jacobson's vials. Science writer Boyce Rensberger was interviewing Jacobson while investigating a story for the New York Times.
We slowly started asking more and more probing questions. At one point, when we were doing the interview, Max got up from his chair, went off to the bathroom or something, came back a couple of minutes later and sat down, and I could see that on the back of his hand, right where one of the big blood vessels goes, there was a little drop of blood just oozing out of that.
It seemed that the doctor was taking a dose of his own medicine. But what was it? When asked, Jacobson made a startling revelation.
He freely told us that he gave amphetamines to these people. He was quite proud of doing this and says it's not true that it's addictive, it's very good, it helps these people perform. They couldn't have made it without me, he would say to us.
Rensberger wanted to verify this disturbing revelation for himself. He had one of the vials tested, and indeed, it did contain amphetamines, speed. But this was not what Jacobson told his patients.
What he told the patients was that the shots contained vitamins. And sometimes he said vitamins and hormones or vitamins and enzymes. In the bottles that he would take his injections from, there were little rocks in the bottom. You shake the bottle, you could hear the rock clinking around inside, and he would tell us that's uranium in there. It gives it extra energy.
Jacobson was misleading his patients, including the President of the United States. But even when Kennedy found out the truth, it was too late. He was hooked.
Bob Kennedy thought there's something really wrong here and took a vial of the stuff out of his brother's medicine cabinet and sent it over to the FBI lab and said, what's in here? And they came back, said some amphetamines, et cetera, et cetera. And then Bob went to his brother and said, you know, this stuff can kill you. You got to stop taking this. And his brother, the president, said, you mind your own business. I don't care. I don't care. This is horse. It makes me feel better and I need it. And that was the end of that.
Kennedy was clearly impressed by the short-term effects of the drug, but the danger was in the long term.
The short-term effects of taking amphetamines are a huge sense of energy. For several hours, 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, you feel as if you need no sleep, you don't need to eat. It's a sense that, in fact, of omnipotence. You feel like you're on top of the world, you can tackle anything. The hazard is in the long run where you build up a tolerance so that you need higher and higher doses to get the same effect. And then you get into the state where the size of the dose produces not only just the desirable effect, but some other toxic effects. Symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. You don't sleep anymore, you don't eat anymore, you don't go home, you know, all these things, and lives fall apart, and people have died.
Kennedy's use of Jacobson's shots was not just experimentation. It was prolonged and regular. Kennedy had placed his health in the hands of a careless doctor.
Jacobson was a loose cannon on deck. He belonged to no medical society. He had no hospital privileges at any hospital. He was entering the White House surreptitiously via the back door on 34 separate occasions. Through the back elevator. The Secret Service files document all of that. He was there but for one reason, to give medication. And there could be nothing good said about the situation. It was a potentially hugely dangerous situation with tremendous implications.
Jacobson was in the White House an average of about once a week. Can you imagine that? And on the major trips, Jacobson was traveling with the president all the time.
No, Max Jacobson was around from almost the beginning to the end. They realized at some point the danger of him being seen around, so he stopped traveling with the official party and used private planes back and forth to come to Washington to shoot up the president and whoever else was in the mood at that time.
I go to Vienna with a good deal of confidence, and I go to Vienna with more confidence as a result of my last 2 days.
Kennedy's meeting in Vienna with the Russian premier, Nikita Khrushchev, was the young president's first task as an international statesman, and nothing was left to chance.
Max waited outside the door in case Kennedy needed another hit.
Whatever faith Kennedy may have had in his doctor and his drugs, he was still no match for the wily Khrushchev.
When he left the room with Khrushchev, he had made a private deal that he would talk with Scotty, James Reston, who was then the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times. And Kennedy comes into the room, no lights, and he slumped into a couch and took the hat and put it over his face and leaned back like this. And Scotty said, "So how was it?" And Kennedy said, "It was the roughest thing in my life. He walked all over me. I didn't realize what it was like, and now I have to go back and do something that shows him I'm not a fool and a coward."
Kennedy returned to Washington a changed man. His mood was noted by those who saw him.
After the Vienna summit, we had a meeting and in the Oval Office, and we were talking about things, and Kennedy said he thought there'd be a nuclear exchange sooner rather than later.
When you've been on drugs like amphetamines for a period of time, particularly if you mix them with other hormones like cortisol, then when you eventually stop that overdose, there's a huge danger that you'll crash in the opposite direction, that you then go into a severe down, which could lead to severe depression.
He was obviously very down in that time, and Bobby Kennedy told me once that the only time he'd saw him cry was in that same period, and he was concerned about nuclear exchange. You know, the Berlin Wall was just going up then, and my goodness, the Soviet Union was rattling the rockets, and Vienna had been a disappointment. He said, "It's not about us, Bobby. It's about children and women. 70 million people destroyed in 10 minutes. And tears came to his eyes. I always felt that was the underlying and the principal theme of his presidency: prevent nuclear disaster.
After the disastrous Vienna summit, Kennedy started a massive buildup of arms and prepared the military for a confrontation with the Soviets. He would not have to wait long before Khrushchev would test his nerve. On the evening of October the 15th, 1962, U.S. spy planes provided conclusive evidence that intermediate-range nuclear missiles were being constructed in Cuba, less than 90 miles from the American mainland. This was the biggest threat to U.S. territory since the attack on Pearl Harbor. The future of Western security now lay with Kennedy, a compulsive risk-taker.
If I had a patient who needed to take cortisone and were also taking amphetamines or drugs of that type, say ecstasy and related drugs, I will be deeply disturbed, because you could easily see the two potentiating one another, so that the whole body was put into overdrive. It just kept on going. And I think that will put them into a highly dangerous situation.
Kennedy's behavior during the growing crisis has been characterized by some as reckless. He made no attempt at securing high-level diplomatic negotiations with the Soviets. Instead, he kept the news of the missiles from the world and his country for 6 days. His first response to Khrushchev was in a television address in which he put nuclear war firmly on the agenda.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced.
The address gave the Soviets a choice: a humiliating withdrawal or nuclear war. This was Kennedy's time to show Khrushchev that he was neither a coward nor a fool. Kennedy personally oversaw the conventional and nuclear buildup.
I was on a trip that he took to Florida to look at the military preparations. And he asked the colonel who was with us, what are they doing? He said, well, he says, we have 5 of those. They each have 100 megatons each. And they're ready to go like that. That hit me.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know what to do.
I hoped that I was home with my family if the missiles came, because I could help them. If I was at the White House, I either went with the president when he was evacuated, if we had time, and we hope we had time, or I was part of the crater.
Where we really were close to nuclear war, and yet he's taking these drugs that can make him feel he's invincible, nothing can stop him. He had his finger on the button, and Max may have had his needle in Kennedy's arm.
In October 1962, the world was on the brink of nuclear war. Soviet forces were constructing a battery of nuclear missiles in Cuba. The response to this provocation now lay in the hands of the President of the United States. But new evidence suggests he was dependent on amphetamines supplied by society doctor Max Jacobson. Jacobson's memoirs refer to several meetings with Kennedy during that time. At the height of the crisis, a U.S. spy plane was shot down over Cuba. The military's response was unequivocal.
On Saturday afternoon, the 27th, the Joint Chiefs at, I think, at 4:30 p.m., recommended unanimously to the President that we attack Cuba within 36 hours, that is, say, on Monday. We didn't know it then, but events were slipping out of control.
Kennedy's advisors were telling him to match his tough words with action. The intention had been to humiliate Khrushchev, not to start a nuclear war. But now that it was a very real possibility, Kennedy quickly sought a way out. He sent his brother Bobby to the Soviet embassy to offer a secret deal to Khrushchev. The U.S. would pull out some aging missiles from Turkey if Khrushchev backed down over Cuba. The fate of the world now lay with the Soviet premier.
Nikita Khrushchev saved the world from a thermonuclear war. God only knows. I know I'd be dead. I mean, it was just absolute stupidity. Sad. We come so close to killing millions of Americans and Russians.
I have today been informed by Chairman Khrushchev that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days.
In the eyes of the public, Kennedy had gone eyeball to eyeball with Khrushchev, and Khrushchev was the one to blink first. No mention was made of the secret deal, a deal that could have been made well before the world was brought to the brink of war. Kennedy's escalation of the crisis, together with his consumption of both steroids and amphetamines, is seen by some as signs of increasingly reckless behavior.
I think he was in a hurry, and I think he was in a hurry because he expected to die at an early age. His favorite poem was I Have a Rendezvous with Death by Alan Seeger, which he would quote frequently.
But I've a rendezvous with death. At midnight, in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true, I shall not fail that rendezvous.
Kennedy always thought his illness would catch up with him in the end. Even though it was an assassin's bullet that killed him, his physical condition may also have played a significant role.
When he was riding in the open limousine, he was wearing a back brace, and the first shot that hit Kennedy and exited the front of his throat almost certainly would have not caused him to fall over. But the back brace held him in an upright position. And the second bullet, of course, struck him in the head and killed him. So if it weren't for the back brace, he might have survived the assassination attempt.
It was shortly after noon when the president's car rounded the fatal corner, and suddenly several gunshots rang out.
Over-medication with steroids frequently induces a heightened sense of risk-taking. Had he lived into his second term and continued to utilize the medication, the implications would have been horrific. You've got a prescription for a disaster there.
Fathers and mothers fell to the ground and used their own bodies to shield their children.
Physically or otherwise, with the multitude of areas he was exploring, he would not have been able to finish out his second term.
Mrs. Kennedy, escorted by two women, hurried into the hospital.
All he was trying with all these massive intakes of these various medicines was to have a normal life. I mean, it's not a drug addict. It's not somebody who's trying to get high.
Pallbearers lifted the bronze casket from a loading dock and carried
somebody who just wants to have a normal energy of a man of his age.
State in the nation's capital.
President John F. Kennedy was cut down by an assassin's bullets on November 22, 1963. He had been in office for less than 3 years. However, one of the great tragedies of John Kennedy's life was that his burning desire to overcome his ill health and show the world that he could achieve greatness drew him to use drugs that in the end could have destroyed him. Had his life not been brutally cut short, John F. Kennedy may well have been remembered in an entirely different way.
The unveiling of John Kennedy's bouts with drug abuse should not obscure the essential lesson of his life, the heroic story of a man determined to overcome his physical limitations in order to fulfill his destiny. And he did just that.
They understood the system, they understood new politics, they understood so much that none of these other people really understood. By the time of the convention, I was quite convinced that he'd get the nomination and he would win.
But Kennedy was hiding a secret he feared would expose his public image as a sham and torpedo his chances of becoming president. In July 1960, John F. Kennedy was poised to win the nomination of the Democratic Party, his first step to becoming president. But an incident from his past was about to come back to haunt him. 13 years earlier, in 1947, a doctor is called to a London hotel. One of the guests is seriously ill. He's confused and dizzy. He's too weak to stand. His body is racked in pain and he can't stop vomiting. He drifts in and out of consciousness. The guest is John F. Kennedy.
He was a friend of Pamela Churchill. She called her father-in-law, Winston Churchill's doctor, who came over, examined him, got him up and whatnot, and then said to her out in the hallway that your young friend hasn't long to live.
The doctor had recognized all the hallmarks of a rare and life-threatening condition: Addison's disease. Kennedy's adrenal glands, vital organs essential to the body's defenses, had failed.
The adrenal glands make cortisol, and it's a terribly important hormone. It's one of the most important hormones. And what cortisol appears to do is act as a stress hormone. And if you don't have cortisol, you don't respond to stress. So the patient just feels tired, they feel debilitated, they look rather emaciated. Life just isn't worth living.
Kennedy was only 30 years old, but the Addison's disease was robbing his energy and vitality. But the events in London showed that the disease also had a sinister and unpredictable side.
The danger is that they may suddenly undergo some sort of severe stress or some sort of accident. The body then hasn't got the reserve of cortisol to fight that, and it can be lethal, they can die.
Jack Kennedy had a very, very serious medical problem.
He was not going to admit that he was sick. There's nothing he was going to say he could not do.
Kennedy was more promiscuous with drugs and pharmaceuticals than he ever was with women.
It was the height of the Cold War, as America and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of all-out war. President John F. Kennedy had his finger poised over the nuclear button, but all was not well in the White House. Kennedy was a man grappling with physical and mental demons.
Events were slipping out of control. Where would it have ended? In utter disaster.
While the fate of the world hung in the balance, the president of the greatest power on earth was battling debilitating disease and drug abuse. The story behind the story of the Kennedy years. An unsolved history.
And I can assure all of you here, we will carry the fight to the people in the fall, and we shall win.
When he was nominated for president in this building in the summer of 1960, John F. Kennedy was the very image of youthful energy and vigor. But there was a side to John Kennedy that was kept hidden all his life. Over the next hour, Unsolved History examines the disturbing medical history of this iconic leader.
Senator Kennedy, a tireless campaigner, goes to all sections of the country, spelling out his views on domestic...
In July 1960, when Senator John F. Kennedy began his campaign to become president, Americans faced a turning point in their history. Do they vote for the gray establishment figures of the Eisenhower years? Or do they vote for a young, dynamic, and progressive Kennedy?
Kennedy was trying to suggest that he would be something very, very different, that he would be a strong leader, a dynamic leader. Let's get the country moving again after 8 years of rest with Eisenhower.
I made my judgment long ago that the basic issue of this campaign was the question of whether the people of the United States believed it was time they started moving again. They started going forward again.
Kennedy, in his campaign speeches and as president, used to talk about vigor, and people used to always joke about his urging the American people to be vigorous and to exercise. And he really did contribute to a physical fitness craze that swept the United States and much of the world, I guess, and still is with us.
It was the beginning of a new era. People sensed that the American dream was within their reach.
There was a new generation. The people that had really led the Allies in the war were fading out. Churchill was going, Ike was gone, the old generals had all retired, and there was now the GIs, the people that fought the war, the young men. And there was this great upsurge in America, people going to college on the GI Bill, you know, cooking steaks, building cars, doing a lot of things that had been put off literally for the better part of 20 years if you throw in the Great Depression.
Journalist Hugh Sidey was assigned to cover Kennedy's campaign for Time magazine and was impressed with what he saw as a new breed of politician.
It was apparent to me that the Kennedys were way ahead.